Too big to birth, too precious to abandon. One human gave her a second chance. Ethan Mason was used to the silence of his isolated life, nestled in the countryside far away from the chaos of the city. His small farmhouse, tucked amidst acres of rolling green fields and dense woods, had always been a sanctuary for him. As a wildlife biologist, Ethan's work often took him into the wilderness, but it was his personal solitude that he cherished most. He had no family to speak of, no wife, no children. His wife had left him years ago, unable to endure the strain of their fertility issues, and since then, Ethan had buried himself in his work, never truly seeking companionship again. His dreams of fatherhood had faded with each passing year, as medical tests and sterile appointments confirmed time and again that he wasn't going to be able to have children. It was a harsh reality that lingered like a shadow in the corners of his mind, but one he had come to accept. He filled the void with his research, his books, and the quiet hum of life in the countryside. It was on a particularly clear evening, with the stars twinkling brightly in the vast expanse above, that Ethan's life took an unexpected turn. He had been standing in his garden, inspecting a few new plantings, when the sky above him suddenly lit up with an unnatural brightness. The flash was so intense it almost seemed like daylight, and before he could fully process what he was seeing, there was a deafening boom that rattled the very air around him. His heart raced in his chest, and instinctively, he bolted toward the woods. His years of living in such solitude had made him hypersensitive to the smallest disturbances in nature, but this was something entirely different. A crash? A meteor? An aircraft? His mind raced, but his feet moved faster. He pushed through the brush, racing against his own thoughts as he reached the clearing where the light had originated. The scene before him was nothing short of surreal. The trees had been torn asunder, their trunks split down the middle, their leaves and branches scattered across the earth like a torn-up rug. The ground was scorched, glowing with an eerie orange hue where the impact had occurred, and at the center of the destruction lay a figure crumpled on the ground. Ethan's breath hitched as he knelt beside the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't a human, at least not entirely. The girl, if she could even be called that, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin, pale and translucent, shimmered in the dim light. Long silver hair spilled around her like liquid mercury, and her eyes were unlike any human eyes Ethan had ever seen. They glowed faintly, a soft luminescent blue, as if lit from within. She was enormous, much larger than any person Ethan had ever encountered. Even lying unconscious on the ground, she seemed like she should not belong in his world. Her features were delicate, yet alien, an ethereal beauty, but one so foreign it was hard for his mind to fully process. He stared at her, unsure of what he was witnessing. For a moment, panic gripped him, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a deep, gnawing concern. She was hurt, she was alive. And in that moment, all rational thought flew out the window. Without a second thought, Ethan rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he gently touched her arm, careful not to hurt her further. Her skin was cool to the touch, but soft, almost like the finest silk. She was breathing, though her breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of life. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. She was alien. She wasn't from this world, that much was clear. But she was still alive, and she needed help. Ethan's first instinct was to call for help, but the truth was that no one would believe him, and he knew it. The world wasn't ready for this. And even if they were, what would they do? Could they even help her? He couldn't leave her like this, not alone in the woods, not like he had been alone all his life. No, there was no choice. He had to take her back. Carefully, Ethan lifted her in his arms, marveling at her size and weight, which felt deceptively light for someone so large. She was so delicate, so fragile in his grasp, and yet there was an unmistakable power in her presence. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it in his bones. He made his way back to the house, his heart still pounding in his chest, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was she? Where had she come from? Why had she crash-landed in his yard of all places? As he reached the house, Ethan pushed open the door and gently laid the girl on the couch. He stared at her, unsure of what to do next. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered, and yet he knew one thing for sure. She needed help. He couldn't just leave her there. He couldn't walk away from this. He had no idea how to care for an alien, but he had to try. For reasons he couldn't explain. Something deep inside him told him this was his responsibility now. And so he began. He carefully checked her injuries, using his medical knowledge to clean and dress the cuts and bruises on her body. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder what her story was. Where had she come from? What was her purpose? The questions piled up, but all he could do was focus on the task at hand, caring for her. She was going to wake up soon, and when she did, he had no idea what to say, what to do. But for now, all he could do was take it one step at a time. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: his life had just changed forever. And for better or worse, he was now responsible for this strange, otherworldly girl who had fallen from the stars. As the days passed, Ethan found himself enveloped in a strange, delicate routine that centered around Lyra. Each morning, he would wake to the sound of birds chirping outside his window, the gentle rustling of the trees in the wind, and the familiar quiet of his home. But it wasn't the same anymore. His home had changed. His life had changed. It wasn't just the presence of Lyra that made everything feel different. It was the sheer weight of responsibility he now carried. He had never expected anything like this. One moment, his life had been marked by silence, by solitude. And then, in a flash of bright light, everything had been irrevocably altered. Lyra, this alien girl with her translucent skin and glowing eyes, had appeared in his life, not as a momentary distraction, but as something permanent, something that pulled him from his isolation and made him confront the future in a way he never had before. At first, Lyra didn't speak. She couldn't. Ethan had tried in the early days to communicate with her through words, but there was no response. She didn't seem to understand him, at least not in any conventional sense. But he could see the flicker of awareness in her eyes. She wasn't completely unresponsive, not entirely unreachable. She followed his movements with her gaze, sometimes reaching out with her hand, tentative and uncertain, almost as though she were unsure of the safety of the space between them. Ethan, in turn, did everything he could to make her feel comfortable. He didn't know where she came from, or what kind of life she had lived, but he had a sense that she had been alone for a long time. Even before the crash, she had seemed to exist in a world of her own, one where she was set apart from others, isolated in ways that were hard for him to comprehend. Every day, he took small steps to help her acclimate, teaching her basic things about Earth, gesturing to objects, pointing to the sky, showing her food, and miming simple actions in an attempt to build some understanding. He didn't know if she would respond, but he had to try. Slowly, something began to shift. On the fifth day, when he prepared breakfast, Lyra surprised him. She watched intently as he cracked eggs into a bowl and stirred them with a spoon. Then, to his shock, she extended her hand toward the bowl, touching the eggs with an exploratory finger. Her skin, even now, felt almost cold to the touch, a stark contrast to the warmth of his own skin. She paused, looking at him expectantly, as though waiting for some kind of validation. Ethan smiled and nodded, gesturing for her to join him. He had no idea what she might be capable of, but he knew that one small act of communication, her reaching out, was a sign of progress, a breakthrough. "You want to try?" he asked, unsure if she could understand the words. But his tone was warm, inviting. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, then, tentatively, she mimicked his movements, slowly dipping her hand into the bowl of eggs, feeling the cool liquid with cautious curiosity. Ethan's heart swelled at the sight, his hope reigniting. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days were filled with small moments of connection, moments that meant the world to him. Lyra began to gesture back at him, using her large, graceful hands to mimic his actions. She still couldn't speak, but there was a sense of communication now, a kind of non-verbal exchange that grew clearer by the day. Lyra was intelligent, he could tell that much, but she was still so foreign to him, so much an enigma. The way her body moved was different from anything he had ever seen. The way she processed the world was so foreign that it often left him in awe. Her senses were sharp, even though she appeared fragile. One afternoon, as Ethan was working in the garden, Lyra had stood beside him, watching his every move. She reached down and touched the soil, feeling its texture beneath her fingertips, then looked back at him with her glowing eyes, as though seeking confirmation of her own actions. It was moments like that, quiet and small, that made Ethan realize just how much she was absorbing, learning from him. She was starting to understand the world around her, starting to understand Earth in the most elemental way. In turn, Ethan was learning to read her. He was learning to recognize the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she tilted her head when something intrigued her, or the way her body stiffened when she was nervous or uncertain. There were times when she would sit in the corner of the room, her legs drawn up to her chest, her eyes far away, and he would simply sit beside her, not speaking, but offering her a presence of calm. He didn't know if it comforted her, but he could tell she appreciated it. Ethan's attention to her, his patience, seemed to encourage her to take more risks. One night, after a long day of silence, Lyra did something that took him completely by surprise. As he sat reading a book by the fire, she suddenly reached out and touched his arm, her cool fingers brushing against his skin. He looked up, startled, and their eyes locked. There was a moment of recognition, a silent understanding passing between them. Lyra's eyes, though still glowing faintly, held something more now, something softer, something that Ethan could only describe as trust. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any of it. He had been prepared to care for her, to provide for her safety. But the emotional connection that was developing between them was something he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in his life, he felt needed, not just by anyone, but by someone who was not of his world, someone who had no one else but him. It was a heavy weight to bear, but it was also one that filled him with a sense of purpose. He would protect her, keep her safe from the outside world, from whatever dangers awaited her once the truth of her existence was revealed, and he would continue to learn about her, to discover who she was, what she needed. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made it a priority to understand her more fully, to care for her as best he could. He began studying alien biology, trying to decipher anything that might give him insight into how to care for her. He learned that she wasn't like humans in many ways.
Her body required unique care. Her diet, her sleep patterns, even the way she communicated, were all unlike anything he'd encountered. Yet she was intelligent, adaptive, and despite the significant language barrier, she had begun to form a kind of unspoken connection with him.
Lyra was starting to learn the most basic of human ways, how to eat with utensils, how to communicate through small gestures, how to understand simple concepts. And every day, Ethan was learning from her as well, discovering more about the girl who had fallen from the stars. She was an enigma, a creature of both beauty and fragility, and Ethan knew that no matter what happened, no matter how difficult it might become, he couldn't leave her behind. In her eyes he saw the silent plea of someone who had been cast aside, someone who had nowhere to go. She was no longer just an alien. She was a girl who needed help, someone whose life had been shattered by forces beyond her control. And for reasons Ethan still couldn't fully comprehend, he knew he was the one she needed. He wasn't sure how to move forward, what the future would look like. but he was beginning to realize that he would go to any lengths to ensure that Lyra was safe. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. They had become something more than just caretaker and alien. They had become something akin to family, bound together by shared isolation, by their mutual need for understanding and companionship. What started as a moment of fear and confusion had turned into something far deeper. Ethan had no idea what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her go. He would protect her, help her, and fight for her if necessary. Lyra was now a part of his life, and that meant he would never be alone again. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Lyra settled into an unusual but comforting rhythm. Their lives intertwined in ways that neither could have anticipated. The world outside their little sanctuary, the farmhouse and its surrounding land, continued as it always had, untouched by the extraordinary circumstances that had transformed their daily existence. The rest of the world remained oblivious to the alien girl living under his roof, to the quiet companionship that had formed between the two of them. It was an arrangement that suited Ethan. He had always preferred isolation, the peaceful seclusion of the countryside, and it seemed to bring Lyra a measure of comfort as well. She had started to adjust more to Earth's ways, albeit in her own peculiar way. Lyra wasn't entirely human, but she was learning, adapting. It was as if she was starting to piece together the puzzle of life on Earth, slowly, painstakingly, through trial and error. She had an innate grace, a fluidity of movement that made everything she did seem effortless, but at the same time, there was an unspoken tension in her, as though she were always on alert, always on the edge of understanding something. Ethan had learned to be patient with her, to give her the time and space she needed to make sense of her new surroundings. But it was hard to ignore the constant undercurrent of worry that ran through him. He knew that sooner or later her presence here would draw attention, and the outside world would demand answers. What would they do if they found out? What if they decided she needed to be studied, dissected, or worse? Lyra was vulnerable. She didn't know this world, didn't know its rules or its dangers, and while Ethan had been doing everything he could to protect her, there was always the lingering fear that it might not be enough. He had made sure to keep her hidden from the world, never letting anyone come too close, never taking her to town, always keeping her confined within the walls of their home. The only people who knew about her were the few people in his life, who had already passed into distant memory, his ex-wife and a handful of colleagues, but he hadn't spoken to them in years. It was a life of silence, a life where the only voice was the one that echoed in his head, questioning whether what he was doing was right. Could he keep her safe forever? Should he even try? But the truth was, as the days wore on, Ethan couldn't bring himself to consider letting her go. The bond between them had deepened, as though they were two souls connected by fate itself. Lyra had started to show signs of trust, even affection. She would often follow him around the house, shadowing his every movement, sitting by him when he ate, or lying beside him as he worked. There were times when she would reach out, her cool, delicate fingers brushing against his hand, as if seeking reassurance. And every time, without fail, he would offer her a soft smile, a wordless promise that she wasn't alone, that he would never let her down. Yet there were moments of quiet unease, moments when Lyra would withdraw into herself, retreating into a corner of the house, her expression distant and unreadable. Ethan had learned to recognize these moments when she seemed lost in thought, when she stared out of the window for hours, her eyes filled with a kind of sorrow that he couldn't fully understand. It was during these times that he would try his best to reach out, to draw her back from whatever dark place her mind had wandered to. He would talk to her softly, reassuring her, even though he didn't know if she understood his words. He had no idea what kind of life she had lived before crashing on Earth, but he could sense the weight of her past in the way she held herself. She wasn't just an alien, a creature from another world. She was a person with feelings, with a history. There were days when she would exhibit a kind of quiet strength, her confidence growing as she began to mimic more human behaviors. But there were also moments when she would curl up into a ball, as though she were trying to protect herself from some invisible threat. Ethan had never pushed her on it, never demanded answers. He knew better than that. Lyra would tell him when she was ready. Until then, he would wait, patiently. It was during one of these moments, when Lyra had retreated to her quiet corner by the fire, that Ethan began to question everything. The fear that had been building in him for months now surged again. What if he couldn't keep her safe? What if the world found out? Lyra wasn't just a girl who had fallen from the sky. She was something far more important, far more valuable, and her presence was a threat to the world's status quo. The government, scientists, military, they would all want her. They would want to understand her, control her, perhaps even use her for their own purposes. Ethan shuddered at the thought. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let them take her from him. In that moment, as he looked at Lyra curled up on the floor, her silvery hair spilling across the rug, he realized something. She was no longer just a responsibility. She had become a part of him, a piece of his soul that he would protect with every fiber of his being. He didn't know how to fight the world, how to protect her from forces far beyond his control, but he knew one thing for sure: he would not let her go. The next day, Ethan took matters into his own hands. He started to make plans. He had spent months thinking about it, but now the time had come to act. He couldn't keep Lyra hidden forever. They couldn't stay here in the farmhouse forever. Soon, the world would start asking questions, and when it did, Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to shield her any longer. He had no idea what his next step would be, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to find someone who could help, someone who would understand, someone who could provide the kind of knowledge that Ethan didn't have, someone who could help protect Lyra. But even as he formulated his plans, a knot tightened in his stomach. The outside world was a dangerous place, and no matter how much he wanted to protect her, no matter how much he cared for her, he had no idea what kind of future awaited them both. All he could do was hope that together they would be able to face whatever came next, and perhaps more importantly, that Lyra would finally find the peace she so desperately needed. As the days stretched on, the weight of Ethan's decisions began to settle into his bones like an uncomfortable ache. He had always been a man of logic, someone who took pride in his ability to plan, to foresee the consequences of his actions. But in this case, there was no blueprint for what was happening. There was no guidebook on how to protect an alien, a girl who had fallen from the sky, or how to navigate the complex web of secrecy, fear, and uncertainty that surrounded their lives now. His house, once a sanctuary of peace and quiet, had become a fortress, and it was all because of her, Lyra. She had changed everything. His every decision was now made with her in mind, every action a step toward ensuring her safety, her well-being. It wasn't just about hiding anymore. Hiding was no longer enough. The threat was growing, the weight of the outside world pressing in closer with each passing day. Lyra, despite her intelligence and adaptability, was still vulnerable, still too fragile in a world that didn't understand her. Ethan had spent countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of ways to shield her. His mind raced, spinning with ideas, but none of them seemed quite right. Should he take her to the government, find a way to keep her under their protection? No, that idea was quickly dismissed. He had seen enough of the world to know that those in power would want to control her, experiment on her, use her as a pawn. The thought made him shudder. He couldn't let that happen. The answer, he realized, wasn't about hiding or keeping her under lock and key. It was about taking her somewhere they could be free, somewhere they could disappear from the world, start anew, and make sure that no one could find them. But even as the idea began to form, there was a terrifying uncertainty that lingered in the back of his mind. Would Lyra even want to leave? She had come to depend on him. Yes. But she had never shown any desire to go anywhere. She didn't speak of her past or of where she came from. And though he had spent hours trying to decipher the hidden depths of her quiet nature, he knew that there were things she would never share. There was an emotional distance between them, one that he could never quite cross. And yet, the moments they spent together, the small, quiet exchanges, the tentative glances, the touches that spoke volumes, had created a bond that neither of them had anticipated. In the mornings, when Lyra would sit at the table, eating her breakfast, she would often look at him with those wide, glowing eyes, as though trying to understand him, as though she was searching for something in him. Ethan never had the answer. She saw it, but he couldn't help but feel that her trust in him was slowly deepening. She had grown so much since he first found her. She was no longer the frightened, fragile creature who had stumbled into his life. She was becoming something more confident, more inquisitive, more attuned to the world around her. But she was still an alien. She was still a mystery, one that he was determined to protect. He had been thinking about it for days, running the plan over and over in his mind. If they were to leave, they would need resources, money, supplies, a way to travel without drawing attention. Ethan had never been a man who relied on others, but now he found himself in need of help. Help from someone who could provide the resources he didn't have, who could guide him through the next steps. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. He had already begun reaching out, using contacts from his past, from years ago, to gather the information he needed. Some of them were old colleagues from his time in the military, people he had trusted in the past. He wasn't proud of that part of his history, but it was the only avenue left to him. As he sat in the quiet of the evening, looking at Lyra as she quietly worked on a puzzle, her delicate fingers manipulating the pieces with surprising dexterity, he realized that the time had come. They couldn't stay hidden forever. And if he wanted to ensure her safety, he would have to act, no matter the consequences. His decision was made, but as with all decisions, there were no guarantees. That night, as he tucked Lyra into bed, her small frame curled under the thick blankets, her luminous eyes wide open, watching him with an unreadable expression, Ethan felt a pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Would she be safe? Was he doing this for her? Or was he doing it for himself, to rid himself of the gnawing fear that came with the weight of their secret? The uncertainty clawed at him, but there was no going back. The next day, he began the preparations. He gathered everything they would need, clothing, food, money, and made the necessary arrangements to meet the people who could help him. The plan was simple enough. Leave the house, make their way to a safe location where they could disappear for good. There were places far off the grid where they could start over. He had the resources, the connections, and the means to make it happen. But even as the pieces of the plan began to fall into place, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a paranoid thought, but one that had been creeping into his mind over the last few weeks. He kept seeing shadows, feeling eyes on him when he went into town, sensing something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Lyra, too, had become more alert, her head swiveling around at every sound, her eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't speak, but Ethan could see it in her. The fear that something was coming, something he couldn't control. That afternoon, as Ethan prepared for their departure, a knock on the door shattered the fragile calm of the house. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, staring at the door. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to do. He had been so careful, so meticulous in his preparations, and yet he had been found. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice, low, familiar, and chilling. "Ethan, open up. We need to talk." His blood ran cold. The voice belonged to someone from his past, someone who knew him too well. It was a person who could easily ruin everything. Ethan's mind raced as he turned to Lyra, his eyes meeting hers in a silent exchange. There was no time to waste. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Whatever came next, he couldn't let them take. Not now, not ever.